My stepfather disowned me for being gay, then showed up asking me to pay for his heart surgery. I was 13 the first time my stepfather hinted that something about me made his skin crawl. It was just a look, really, this fleeting sneer that crossed his face when he saw me arranging flowers on the dining room table with my mom. My mother used to love fresh flowers. She'd buy bouquets every week and throw them in a vase. That day, for some reason, I'd taken it upon myself to fan them out nicely and pick out the wilted petals. Carl, my stepdad, walked in, paused at the threshold of the kitchen, gave me that disgusted look, and then just walked away without saying a word. At the time, I couldn't fully grasp what it meant. I just felt an uneasy sting in my stomach, like I'd done something wrong without knowing what it was. But in retrospect, I realized that was the earliest sign of the storm that would eventually tear my family apart. Carl had come into my life when I was about 6 years old. My biological father had left the picture long before that. My parents had divorced when I was still practically a baby. Mom said he just wasn't cut out for fatherhood. I had no memories of him, so I didn't have much to compare Carl to. For the first few years of his marriage to my mom, he was tolerable, if not the perfect father figure I'd wanted. There were times he'd take us out to the beach or the park, and we'd have what seemed like a normal family outing. But even at a young age, I sensed that Carl had a rigid sense of how things were supposed to be. He liked to be in control of his space, and he liked to be in control of my mother softly, subtly, but in so many ways that built up over time. If I was too loud, he'd give a tight-lipped glare. If I wore clothes he considered too flashy, he'd make a snide remark about how boys don't dress like that. In small increments, those comments chipped away at me until I began to feel uneasy in my own skin. I guess I should mention that for a while, I was just your average quiet kid who liked art, music, and reading more than sports or roughhousing. I was never a man's man, and I knew it even before I realized I was gay. I'd see my classmates tossing footballs, bragging about how they tackled each other on the field, and I'd just sit on a bench scribbling little sketches in a notebook. Some of my friends were more like me, mild, artistic, thoughtful. We'd hang out, talk about books, maybe jam out on guitars if someone brought one to school. It never crossed my mind that my preferences were wrong or suspect. I figured I was just me, you know? Then came puberty, and with it the slow, dawning realization that the quickening of my heart I felt around certain guys wasn't random. At first, I tried to ignore it. Everyone else was going on about crushes on girls, film actresses, pop singers, that popular girl in math class. I felt a creeping sense of dread that I wasn't reacting the way my male friends were. Instead, I'd catch myself looking a moment too long at some boy's face, noticing details like how his hair curled at the nape of his neck or how his eyes lit up when he laughed. I knew deep down that I wasn't just admiring them in a platonic way. That knowledge terrified me. I remember the moment I confessed my suspicions to my mom. I was 14, and we were alone one evening while Carl was working late. We were on the couch watching some cheesy drama on TV, and there was this scene where a character came out to his family. It jolted me. I turned to my mom, my throat tight, and I said, "Mom, I think I might be..." The words caught in my throat. She muted the TV and looked at me with wide eyes. I expected her to freak out, but she didn't. Instead, she took a shaky breath and said, "Sweetheart, you can tell me anything." So I told her haltingly, tears stinging my eyes. She wrapped me in a hug and told me it was okay, that she loved me no matter what. For a glorious few minutes, I felt safe. But then I saw this flicker of fear in her eyes, almost like a reflection of the worry in my own mind. She said something along the lines of, "Let's just make sure we keep this between us for now, okay?" I asked why, and she tried to explain that Carl wouldn't understand, that it might upset him. I asked if she would support me if I told him. She paused before saying, "Of course," but her voice was thin. I let the subject drop. In hindsight, that was when I should have realized that if she was scared of his reaction, there was a reason. But I was just a kid, desperate for love and acceptance, so I let it go. Carl found out anyway. I'm not entirely sure how. Maybe he overheard a phone conversation I had with a friend, or maybe he snooped and found something I'd written in my journal. One day when I was 14, he exploded at dinner, practically slamming his fork on the table. He glared at me, then my mom, and snarled, Is there something you want to tell me about your son? I felt my stomach drop. My mom tried to diffuse it, but Carl was like a volcano that had been simmering just under the surface, waiting for an excuse to erupt. The hatred in his words still burns in my memory. I won't have a living under my roof. I stared at my plate, tears blurring my vision, too stunned to speak. My mom told him to calm down, said we could talk about this like adults, and he just got up and stormed out of the room. It was the first time I heard him refer to me in such a vile manner, but it definitely wouldn't be the last. After that dinner, something shifted in our household. My mother was anxious all the time, and I withdrew into myself, spending most of my time in my room. Carl, for his part, barely spoke to me unless it was to bark orders or belittle me for something mundane, like the way I dressed or the music I listened to. I started practicing how to move, how to talk, constantly checking myself to make sure I wasn't doing anything too gay. But no matter what I did, Carl had a gripe. He'd harp on how I talk like a girl, how my walk wasn't manly, how he was embarrassed to be seen with me. My self-esteem plummeted, and I wished I could vanish. That's how I lived from age 14 to 18, in a state of quiet terror. The worst part was the secrecy. I was out to a few close friends, but not publicly, because I knew it would send Carl into a complete meltdown. Even telling my mother the simplest details, like if I found someone cute, had to be done in hushed whispers when Carl was out of the house. It was a stifling environment, and I counted down the days until I could leave for college or just get out. I fantasized about renting a tiny apartment in some big city and starting a new life where nobody cared about who I loved. Everything came to a head on my 18th birthday. Carl hadn't even acknowledged the day with so much as a happy birthday. My mom got me a small cake, and we shared it quietly while he was in the garage tinkering with his tools. That night, I was scrolling through social media, and on a whim, I wrote a short post. I'm gay, and I'm tired of hiding. # live your truth. The moment I hit post, it felt like a burden had been lifted. But I also knew that if Carl saw it, all hell would break loose. He did see it. I guess one of his relatives or a family friend must have come across my post. A few days later, Carl confronted me in the living room. Mom was at work, so it was just the two of us. He held up his phone like a piece of damning evidence, his face twisted with fury. He said, "So you're a now? You're flaunting it all over the internet? Under my roof?" Something in me snapped. I'd taken his abuse for so long, and I was just done. I told him it was my life, my social media, and I could post whatever I wanted. He grabbed me by the shirt and shoved me against the wall, snarling that I was an abomination and that he couldn't stand the sight of me anymore. His fist clenched like he was about to hit me, but he didn't. Instead, he let go, turned his back, and muttered, "Get out of my house." That was it. I packed a small duffel with whatever I could grab and left. I remember standing on the sidewalk with nowhere to go, tears blurring my eyes. I tried calling my mom, but she didn't pick up. She'd always told me she'd protect me, yet here I was alone. Eventually, she did call me back and told me to come home, that she'd talk to Carl, that maybe we could figure it out. But I knew better by then. There was nothing to figure out. Carl made up his mind a long time ago. If I was openly gay, I was, in his eyes, worthless and disgusting. So I stayed with a friend for a few months, couch surfing until I could find a more stable situation. That was the last time I lived under Carl's roof. My mom helped me financially a little bit, slipping me money or groceries, but she was terrified of him finding out she was doing it. She'd meet me in parking lots, or after her shift, she'd stop by where I was staying to hand me some food and clothes. It was humiliating, but I was thankful for her help, even if it was overshadowed by the knowledge that she was still living with a man who despised me. I'd ask her why she didn't leave him, why she couldn't stand up for me. She'd start crying and say things like, "You don't understand how hard it is," or "He's not always like this." I felt like we were both stuck in some twisted web, except that I was trying to break free, and she was content to stay ensnared. Despite all of this, I managed to get into a decent college in the city. I tried to keep my life moving forward. I got student loans, worked part-time jobs, and rented a tiny studio that doubled as my bedroom, living room, and kitchen. I was broke, but at least I was out of Carl's reach. For a while, I was consumed with bitterness. I'd lie awake at night replaying all the hateful things he'd said to me, imagining confronting him someday when I was rich or powerful or just so far beyond his influence that I could laugh in his face. I told myself that if he ever came crawling back, I'd slam the door on him, just like he did to me. It was a fantasy that kept me going on the darkest days. As time passed, I worked my way through college. I had a flair for design, so I majored in something related graphic design with a minor in marketing. I found I had a knack for branding and digital art, and I poured my heart into it because the more time I spent immersed in design, the less time I spent dwelling on my painful past. My professors noticed my drive. I got internships, and eventually those led to some decent freelance gigs. By the time I graduated, I'd built up enough of a portfolio that I landed a pretty good job at a marketing firm. I felt proud of myself, proud that I'd managed to carve a path forward without Carl's help. Proud that I survived despite his rejection. During these college years, my relationship with my mom was strained, but not entirely severed. She'd text me every so often to ask how I was doing. She never visited, partly because she was terrified Carl would find out. There was a perpetual undertone of guilt in our conversations. I knew she felt guilty for not doing more to defend me, and I felt guilty for making her choose between me and Carl. But that was the dynamic. I rarely asked about him, and she rarely offered any information. It was like we had an unspoken agreement that his name was off limits. I was around 24 when I heard from Carl again, out of the blue. It was a message on social media, of all places, a platform I had only recently reconnected with because I'd used it for job networking. His message was brief and cold. "Your mother and I want to talk to you. Call me." My first instinct was to delete it. But then I worried maybe something had happened to my mom, so I responded with something equally curt. "What's going on?" He told me he'd rather talk on the phone. Against my better judgment, I gave him my number. The phone call was awkward from the start. He sounded older, weaker somehow, not the booming authoritarian voice I remembered. He asked how I was, if I was still in the city. I said yes, I was still there. There was a long pause, and then he sighed and said, "I need to see you face to face." I asked if it was about Mom. He hesitated before answering that she was fine, physically, but that they'd both appreciate a meeting. When I pressed him for specifics, he said something about having a serious matter to discuss. My gut twisted with anxiety, but curiosity and a lingering sense of familial duty made me agree. We arranged to meet at a diner halfway between my place and my childhood town. I got there first, and for several minutes, I sat in a booth by the window, tapping my foot anxiously, scanning the parking lot for his car. My heart was pounding. Part of me was terrified. Part of me was angry. And part of me just wanted to walk out before he even arrived. But I stayed, telling myself maybe my mom needed me. Eventually, I saw him pull up. I almost didn't recognize him. Carl looked smaller, thinner. The lines in his face were deeper, and his hair was completely gray. He walked slowly, like it hurt. The moment he entered the diner, he spotted me and made his way over. No handshake, no hug. He just slid into the seat across from me. I tried to steel myself, wondering if he was about to hurl more insults. Instead, he sighed and said, "Thanks for coming." I eyed him warily, not quite knowing how to respond. The waiter came over and we ordered coffee. For a few agonizing minutes, neither of us spoke. Then, he started telling me how life had been tough for him lately, how he'd been dealing with health issues. My stomach sank as soon as he mentioned doctors, medication, and surgeries. Call it cynicism, but I had a feeling this had something to do with money. So I just waited, sipping my coffee, letting him unravel the story. He had heart problems, serious ones, apparently. His father had died of a heart attack at a relatively young age, and Carl himself started experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath over the past year. The doctors told him he needed major heart surgery, bypass, stents, something complicated. He rattled off medical jargon, glancing at me every so often to see my reaction. I just nodded. He finally got to the point. The surgery was expensive, and while he had health insurance, it wasn't nearly enough to cover everything. The out-of-pocket costs were astronomical, at least for him. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I need your help, son." I nearly choked on my coffee when he called me son. The anger and bitterness I'd buried for so long came roaring back. This was the man who had kicked me out, who'd let me fend for myself at 18 because he couldn't stand the thought of having a gay son. Now he wanted me to help save his life? I took a deep breath and asked the obvious question, why me? He said my mom had told him I had a good job, that I was doing well for myself, and that I might have enough savings or access to a loan to help with the medical bills. My blood boiled. I pictured my mom telling him about my successes, bragging in that half-proud, half-sorrowful tone, trying to show him I wasn't a failure. And he, in turn, saw me as a solution to his financial crisis. I told him point blank, "You disowned me. Why would you think I'd pay for anything?" He tried to muster up some regretful words saying he'd been wrong, that he'd acted out of ignorance or fear, that he's changed. He said he was willing to put the past behind us if I'd just help him get this surgery. I wanted to laugh in his face, but the heartbreak was too real, too raw. Instead, I just stared at him, my mind reeling with memories of all the hateful things he'd said. I thought of the nights I'd cried, alone in a friend's spare room, wondering how I'd survive. I wondered if he had ever felt an ounce of remorse during those years we didn't speak. My voice shook when I finally responded. And if I say no, I expected him to threaten me, to call me ungrateful or any of the slurs he'd used before. But he surprised me. He just bowed his head and said, "Then I guess I die, or I end up in so much debt I lose the house. Either way, I'm out of options." Those words hit me in a weird way. There was a petty side of me that thought, well, that's what you deserve. But there was also a more compassionate side, shaped by the years of therapy I'd gone through, that recognized he was a human in crisis, a very flawed, cruel human, but a human nonetheless. That moral tug-of-war raged in my mind. I told him I'd think about it. I said I needed time to process everything. He tried to say something else, maybe to guilt me further, but I just stood up, left some money for the coffee, and walked out. As soon as I got to my car, I realized I was trembling. I sat there for a while, staring at the steering wheel, my heart thumping. All the anger and pain I'd tried to bury was bubbling up, threatening to overwhelm me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch something. Instead, I just started the car and drove off, not sure where I was going until I found myself parked by a small public park. I sat on a bench, tears stinging my eyes, hating that I was crying over him again after all these years. I wasn't sure how long I sat there. Eventually, I called my best friend, Eric, who'd been with me through so much of my coming out journey. He listened quietly as I told him about Carl's request. When I finished, Eric let out a low whistle. "That's a lot," he said, echoing the swirl in my mind. He asked me if I felt any sense of obligation. I replied that the only obligation I'd ever felt was to my mother, but that she'd barely protected me from Carl. It was complicated. He said, "Look, if you give him the money, it's not because he deserves it. It's because you choose to. But do you want to?" That question lingered with me for days. I called my mom, but she didn't pick up. Instead, she texted me later saying, "Carl told me he talked to you. Please don't hate me, but if you can help, I'd be so grateful." That stung like a betrayal. She was essentially asking me to fix something that neither she nor Carl had the decency to fix years ago when they exiled me. I asked her where she stood in all this, and she gave a convoluted response about not wanting him to die, about him being sorry, about how life is complicated and love is complicated. I ended up talking to my therapist about it. I'd been seeing her on and off for a few years, mainly to deal with the lingering trauma of my upbringing. She told me that the decision was mine alone, and that either choice helping or not helping would come with emotional consequences. If I helped him, I might resent him and possibly myself for enabling him after all his cruelty. If I didn't help, I might feel guilty, especially if he died. It wasn't as simple as refusing, even though a big part of me wanted to. Another factor was the money itself. While I was doing reasonably well, I wasn't rolling in cash. Covering a chunk of expensive surgery would be a big hit to my finances. I could probably handle it with a payment plan or a loan, but it would mean sacrificing some dreams I'd been saving for, like someday buying my own place or even going on a backpacking trip I'd planned with Eric. So this wasn't a trivial favor. It was a major financial burden, especially for a man who once threw me onto the street for being gay. Over the next week, Carl messaged me a few times. The tone of his messages varied wildly. Sometimes he was humble, almost pleading, saying he regretted how he treated me and that he realized he'd been ignorant. Other times, he sounded desperate or angry, accusing me of ignoring him or holding grudges. He even wrote, "You're letting me die just because I said some mean words? You can't forgive your something that happened years ago?" That one made my blood boil. But it also reminded me of how manipulative he could be. It was classic Carl, shifting blame and painting me as the villain for not immediately caving to his demands. And then, out of nowhere, my mother showed up at my apartment. She hadn't visited me in years, always giving some excuse about how busy she was or how she was worried Carl would be upset if he knew she came to see me. But there she stood at my door, looking worn and frail, with watery eyes. I let her in, both curious and wary. She took one look at my living room, my neatly arranged furniture, the small art prints on the walls, the plants on the windowsill, and she burst into tears. I wasn't sure if she was overwhelmed with pride or sadness, but maybe both. She sat on my couch and clutched my hands. She said, "Carl's doctors are saying he needs the surgery within the next few months. He's on medication for now, but he can't wait too long." I said nothing. She must have seen my conflicted expression because she added, "Please understand, I can't lose him, but I don't want to lose you either." That statement felt unfair, like I was being told that if I didn't help, I was the reason she'd lose him. She insisted Carl truly regretted what happened, that he'd changed, that he prayed for forgiveness every night. She said she'd prayed too, for a reconciliation. I just stared at her. I'm not religious, so the notion that he'd prayed the hatred away rang hollow to me. If he was truly sorry, he could have sought me out long before he needed my help. I told her that if he wanted to show me he'd changed, maybe he should have contacted me years ago with an apology rather than turning to me only when he needed money. She cried harder, saying she'd encouraged him to do so, but he was too proud or ashamed. She tried to rationalize it. I told her, that's not my problem. That's not how growth works. You don't get a pass on humility until you're desperate. Still, I felt my resolve wavering under the weight of her tears. This was my mother, the woman who raised me, who, despite her flaws, tried in her own limited way to love me. It was maddening. I wanted to stand my ground and scream, "No, let him face the consequences." But at the same time, I couldn't shake the idea that if he died and I had done nothing, I'd never quite forgive myself. I wasn't sure if that guilt would be enough to poison my peace in the future. In the end, after countless sleepless nights and tearful phone calls to friends, I made a decision. I'd agree to help, but with conditions. The biggest condition was that I wouldn't hand over cash blindly. I'd pay the hospital directly in increments, and only if Carl agreed to sit down and have a real conversation about what happened. If he wanted help, he needed to own up to what he'd done. I also made it clear that I wasn't promising to pay every penny. I'd do what I could, but I wouldn't bankrupt myself for him. When I relayed this to my mother, she seemed relieved, though she must have sensed I wasn't doing it purely out of kindness. She asked if it meant I'd reconcile with Carl. I told her I wasn't sure, maybe I'd find closure, or maybe I'd realize once and for all that he wasn't worth any more of my energy. When I finally spoke to Carl about these conditions, he was surprisingly compliant. He agreed to talk to me whenever I wanted, and he said it was fine for me to pay the hospital directly, but he balked at the idea that I wouldn't necessarily cover everything. He said something like, "What if the hospital demands the full payment up front?" I replied, "Then maybe you should look into other options, charities, loans, or payment plans, because I'm not your cash cow." He sounded displeased, but he tried not to show it too much. He probably realized he was in no position to negotiate. We scheduled a conversation at my apartment, the same place my mother had visited. The plan was that he'd come over after a pre-op appointment, so he'd already be in the city. I took the day off work because I knew I wouldn't be able to focus. All morning, I was anxious pacing, tidying up imaginary messes, going over possible dialogues in my head. When the knock came at my door, my heart lurched. I opened it to see Carl leaning on the frame, a bit out of breath, looking older than ever. He wore a faded windbreaker over a plain shirt, and in his hand, he had a plastic bag that looked like it held prescriptions or some medical documents. He stepped inside, glancing around like he was uncomfortable just being in my space. I offered him a seat on the couch. He sank into it gingerly, and for a long moment, we both just sat there, the silence thick in the air. Finally, I spoke. I told him I wanted to hear him acknowledge what he did to me, how he treated me, how it affected my life. He closed his eyes, took a shuddering breath, and began to speak. He said he grew up in a very conservative household, that his father was strict and had drilled into him the belief that homosexuality was a sin. He said he was always taught that real men were tough, masculine, unyielding. He admitted that when he saw me display anything that didn't fit that mold, like my interest in art or my gentler demeanor, it reminded him of everything he was raised to hate. He said it scared him because it felt like a threat to his worldview, a worldview he had never questioned until recently. I listened, arms folded across my chest, not sure whether to pity him or roll my eyes. He went on to say that after I left, he blamed me for a lot of things, my mom's sadness, the tension in the house. But over time, he noticed that his life wasn't any happier without me there. He claimed he started to wonder if maybe he'd been wrong. The problem is, as he put it, I'm not good at apologizing. He said every time he thought about reaching out, he'd freeze up with pride or shame. Then the health problems hit, and fear of his own mortality made him realize how fleeting life is. He said he understood if I hated him, but he was asking for forgiveness, not just money. It was a lot to process. I asked him if he genuinely believed, even now, that being gay was a sin. He hesitated, his gaze sliding away. I'm still learning, he said at last. I'm trying to unlearn what I was taught, but it's not easy. That half answer told me he still clung to some of his old prejudices, but at least it wasn't a flat-out condemnation. Part of me thought, that's not good enough. But another part acknowledged that people don't change overnight. I told him, I don't owe you forgiveness. You understand that, right? He said yes, he understood. For hours, we talked about the past. I shared specific memories of what he said to me, how it felt, how it scarred me. He apologized for each instance, tears brimming in his eyes at times. I didn't let him gloss over or rationalize them. I wanted him to feel the weight of those words. It was exhausting, reliving that pain, but there was a twisted sense of release in finally confronting him directly. By the time we were done, the sun had set, and I realized we'd spent the better part of the day on this. He looked drained. I felt shaky, like I'd just gone through an emotional ringer. We hadn't ended up hugging or anything. It wasn't some hallmark moment, but there was a raw honesty in the room that I'd never experienced with him before. He thanked me for giving him a chance to speak. I told him that didn't mean I trusted him or that I believed he was a completely different person, but maybe it was a start. In the following weeks, I arranged with the hospital to cover a portion of the surgery costs, enough to ensure that the procedure could move forward, but not so much that I crippled myself financially. I made it clear to Carl that he was responsible for the remaining bills and that he could set up a payment plan or seek additional aid. He accepted, though I could tell he wasn't thrilled. My mother, on the other hand, was effusive in her gratitude. She called me multiple times, crying with relief, saying I was saving Carl's life. I told her, I'm not saving his life. The doctors are. I'm just helping pay. But she insisted that without me, it wouldn't happen. It was a strange limbo. On one hand, I felt like I was doing the morally compassionate thing, and on the other, I felt an undercurrent of resentment. I worried that I was letting myself be used by a man who'd never truly loved me as a son. But I also thought about how, in the aftermath of everything, I was at least strong enough to make my own choices. I wasn't that frightened teenager anymore, cowering under his disapproval. If I was going to help, it would be on my terms, and that alone felt like a kind of personal victory. Carl had his surgery a couple of months later. My mother kept me updated, texting me from the hospital waiting room. The procedure was more complicated than expected, but the doctors were optimistic. I got a text from her saying he was out of surgery and stable in recovery. She wrote, "He asked if you'd come see him." I sat on that text for a long time, unsure how to respond. In the end, I decided I would go, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see this man who'd caused me so much pain, now laid low and vulnerable in a hospital bed. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to witness his humanity in a state where he couldn't hide behind rage. I arrived at the hospital the next day, flowers in hand, more out of courtesy than genuine sentiment. My mother greeted me in the hallway, her eyes red from crying or lack of sleep. She threw her arms around me, repeating, thank you, as if I'd performed some miracle. I gently extricated myself and asked how Carl was doing. She said he was awake, not in great shape, but alert enough to talk. I took a deep breath and walked into his room. He lay there, hooked up to monitors, an IV in his arm, his face looking even more gaunt than before. When he saw me, he tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. I told him to stay put. We were both silent for a moment. Then he managed a small, shaky smile and said, "You came." I nodded, setting the flowers on a chair. He murmured a thank you, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood by his bed, not quite sure what to say. The typical, "How are you feeling?" seemed almost laughably obvious. Still, that's what came out. He said he felt like he'd been run over by a truck, but that the doctors told him everything went as planned. Then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully decipher, some combination of guilt, gratitude, and maybe shame. He said, "I'm sorry for everything. I know it can't fix the past, but I want you to know." I just nodded again. The lump in my throat was impossible to speak around, so I didn't say anything. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, I told him I hoped he'd recover well. Then I left, telling my mom to call me if she needed anything. Walking out of that hospital, I felt an odd mix of relief and sadness. Relief that at least I'd tried to be the bigger person, sadness that this was the father figure I ended up with, a man who only realized he needed me when his life was on the line. In the weeks that followed, Carl slowly recovered. He went home, started physical therapy, made lifestyle changes. My mother kept telling me how grateful he was, how he wanted to have a real father-son relationship now. I remained guarded. I'd occasionally get texts from him, mostly small talk, sometimes a check-in about my work or a random anecdote from his day. I'd reply, but I kept it short. Truthfully, I didn't know if I wanted a relationship beyond basic civility. Part of me was still that hurt teenager wanting to protect myself. Another part of me recognized that people can change, even if it's at a snail's pace and under dire circumstances. But was I willing to open myself up to more potential disappointment? That became the question. My therapist suggested that it didn't have to be all or nothing. I could set boundaries. See him once in a while, test the waters, and see how he behaves. If he respects me, if he acknowledges my identity without any contempt, maybe we can build something new. If he slips back into old patterns, I can walk away, knowing I did my part. So that's what I did. Slowly, tentatively, I met him for coffee a couple of times, always in a public place. We chatted about mundane topics, the weather, my job, his recovery. Occasionally, I'd catch him flinching if a very obviously gay couple walked by or if some flamboyant person caught his eye. He'd avert his gaze like he was fighting the urge to react, but he never said anything hateful in my presence. It was progress, I guess, but it still made me uneasy. The real test came when I invited him and my mom to my apartment for a small get-together. Nothing big, just dinner with me and my boyfriend, a man I'd been seeing for about 6 months. My boyfriend knew about my history, and he was willing to handle an introduction if it meant a chance for me to see if Carl truly accepted me. I was nervous as hell, worrying that Carl would say something disrespectful or get into an argument. But to my surprise, he was polite, if a bit stiff. He shook my boyfriend's hand, asked him what he did for a living, and even managed a polite smile when my boyfriend casually mentioned his coming out story. I could see the gears turning in Carl's head, but he kept his mouth in check. My mom looked almost deliriously happy to have us all in the same room, even though the tension was palpable. After dinner, Carl pulled me aside while my boyfriend and mom were chatting in the living room. He said, in a halting voice, "I'm trying. I still don't fully get it, but I'm really trying." I didn't say anything for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then I just gave a small nod. It felt like the closest thing to an olive branch he could offer in that moment. I realized I still held resentment, but I also saw that he was genuinely making an effort, even if it wasn't perfect. Maybe that's all I could reasonably expect from a man shaped by so many years of homophobia. As time wore on, I found myself less consumed by the bitterness. That's not to say it went away entirely. Some nights, I'd replay old memories and feel a pang of anger that I'd been forced to pay, quite literally, for the chance at any semblance of acceptance from my stepfather. But I'd remind myself that I made a conscious decision to help, not because he deserved it, but because I wanted to be the kind of person who could move forward without hate eating away at me. It was about me choosing how I lived my life, rather than letting him define it with his old cruelty. We're not best friends now, Carl and me. I doubt we ever will be, but we're something. After his surgery, he started joining a local support group for heart patients, many of whom had faced near-death experiences. He told me that hearing other people's stories and regrets made him reflect even more on how he'd treated me. He still has slip-ups, occasional moments where I sense he's wrestling with old biases, but he apologizes more readily now, and I think there's a genuine desire on his part to make amends, even if it's clumsy and inadequate. I'm still navigating this strange new terrain. My relationship with my mom remains complicated. I love her, but I also carry resentment for how she didn't protect me when I needed her most. Yet I see her relief that Carl didn't die and that we're not completely estranged. She tries to be the peacemaker, though she's finally understanding that it's not her job to pressure me to forgive or forget everything overnight. I've insisted on my boundaries, and she seems to respect that now. Every once in a while, I think about that teenage version of me, living in fear in my own home, and I wish I could tell him it gets better. Not perfect, but better. I wish I could tell him he'd someday stand face to face with Carl and see a fragile human being instead of a towering tyrant. I wish I could tell him that the heartbreak he felt would someday serve as a reminder of his own resilience, that he'd not only survive, but find success and love on his own terms. And yes, I wish I could tell him he'd eventually have the power to either let Carl die a victim of his own hatred or help him, and in doing so, claim a measure of emotional victory. Do I regret helping Carl? Some days, maybe a tiny bit, if I'm honest. I'll look at my bank statements or think about how that money could have gone toward a down payment on a house or a bigger step forward in my career. But then I remind myself that revenge letting him suffer because he let me suffer wouldn't have undone my past trauma. It wouldn't have healed those wounds. It would have just poured salt in them over and over. By helping him, I freed myself from the cycle of bitterness, and that might be worth more than any sum of money. Sometimes people ask if I truly believe Carl has changed. I think change is a process, not a moment. Is he a completely different person now? Probably not. But is he someone who's trying to be better? Tentatively, I'd say yes. And in the grand scheme of life, that attempt might be the most we can ever ask of someone who once harbored such deep-rooted hate. When all is said and done, I don't know exactly how our story will end. Maybe over the next few years, he'll soften more, and we'll build a fragile but functional father-son bond. Or maybe we'll drift apart once my sense of obligation has been fulfilled. What I do know is that I'm no longer that scared kid relying on his goodwill. I've built a life, an identity, and a community for myself that can't be taken away by someone else's disapproval. If we stand side by side now, it's because I choose to stand there, not because I need him to survive. I did pay for part of his heart surgery, and he's alive today because of it. Some might say that's poetic justice. He was forced to rely on the very person he disowned for being gay. Others might call it a testament to the unpredictable twists of fate. For me, it's simply an example of how complicated life can be, how the lines between right and wrong, love and hate, acceptance and rejection can blur. In the end, we're all just human beings stumbling through our flaws, praying for second chances. And in a strange way, maybe that's what unites us, even after all the hurt. I still have days where I'm raw with emotion, where I hate him for the years of turmoil he caused me. But then I'll remember how important it was for me to stand in that hospital room, to see him laid bare, and to know I was no longer under his thumb. I'll remember that I did the one thing he refused to do for me all those years, show compassion. And whether he deserved it or not, it was the act of showing it that set me free. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always about absolving someone of their crimes. Sometimes it's about releasing yourself from the hold those crimes have on your life. By agreeing to help him, I took the power back. I made the choice instead of letting him define my choices. And in that sense, I found a measure of peace, fragile though it may be. It's a peace I've fought for and earned on my own terms. So now, at 26, I'm still figuring it all out. I have a promising career, a supportive boyfriend, a circle of friends who love me for who I am. My mother is a phone call away, often texting me pictures of their cat or updates on Carl's health. Carl still sometimes texts me out of the blue. How was your day? Or what do you think of this sports team? That part still makes me laugh. He's trying to find common ground, a shared interest, but we both know sports aren't my thing. Occasionally, I'll humor him, but more often I'll say something like, still more into design and art. You know that. He'll send back a simple yeah, and we'll leave it at that. It's awkward, but it's real. I don't know if we'll ever reach a place where I call him dad and mean it without hesitation. To me, that word still carries the sting of years of longing for acceptance I never got. But at least now I can exist in the same room with him without feeling like I'm suffocating. At least now I know I'm strong enough to face him. If nothing else, I have that. People like to ask for a clean, tidy ending to stories like this. Did he accept you fully? Did you forgive him wholeheartedly? Did everything end happily ever after? Life doesn't work that way. It's messy. It's a patchwork of small steps, setbacks, half apologies, and incremental victories. Maybe the closest thing to a resolution is this. I'm not the boy he hated, and he's not the impenetrable monster I once feared. We're just two flawed individuals who share a complicated history and a fragile present. And for now, that has to be enough. Whether Carl will ever truly embrace that I'm gay in a deep, unconditional way is uncertain. But he's come far enough to share a meal with me and my partner, to at least pretend to be comfortable. That's more than I ever thought I'd see. Sometimes that small hint of progress is all the hope I need that maybe he can continue to evolve. And if he can't, that's on him, not me. I've already found my place in the world, a place where I'm loved and valued without question. And that, ultimately, is the happily ever after I'm writing for myself. Of course, I won't pretend there aren't times I feel used. Like the only reason this tenuous reconciliation started was because he needed my financial support. That thought can still make me angry if I dwell on it too long. But I try to channel that anger into something productive, reminding myself how far I've come, how I now have the resources and resilience to handle such situations. It's my life, my choice, my power. He asked for help and I gave it, but that doesn't erase what he did. It just shows that I refused to become him, a bitter man defined by prejudice and fear. In a broader sense, I think about how many kids out there might be going through something similar, disowned or threatened by a family who can't accept their identity. I wish I could tell each one of them that sometimes the people who hurt you come crawling back in one way or another, needing your help. And when that happens, you get to decide how the story ends. You're no longer just a victim. You hold the cards. You can choose to walk away, or you can choose to extend a hand. Neither choice is inherently wrong. It's all about what helps you heal. That's a power nobody can take from you, not even the family member who once tried to cast you out. In the end, whether you label my decision as forgiveness, pity, or moral high ground, what truly matters is that it was a choice I made for myself. I used to fantasize about a moment like this, Carl on his knees begging for my help, but now that it's come and gone, I realize it's less triumphant and more somber than I ever imagined. There's no victory parade for choosing to do the right thing, no cosmic justice that rewinds time to give me a happy childhood. There's just real life moving forward day by day. And in my real life, I get up in the morning, kiss my boyfriend goodbye as we both head off to work and maybe check a text from my mom or even from Carl. Sometimes he'll send a question about healthy recipes. The doctors told him to watch his diet, and I'll give a short response or send him a link. It's surreal to be in a position where I'm advising the man who once called me a sick freak, but I guess that's the shape of our new normal. Our interactions are cautious, but they exist. I never would have predicted that. Maybe years from now, I'll look back and see this chapter as the turning point, the moment I finally realized I was free. Because when you can stand before the person who hurt you the most and decide on your own terms whether to help or walk away, You're no longer defined by their rejection. I'm defined by my capacity to love, my capacity to stand strong in who I am, and my capacity to choose compassion without sacrificing my self-worth. That's where I am now. Still healing, still questioning, still living a life that is far more fulfilling and open than the one I had under Carl's roof. And if his heart keeps beating because of the help I gave, maybe that's a strange form of poetic justice. The man who tried to break my spirit ended up relying on my spirit of kindness to keep him alive. Life can be ironic like that. I don't know what the final page of this story will look like. Maybe Carl truly becomes a better man. Maybe he slides back into old prejudices. Maybe we maintain a civil relationship that never quite blossoms into real warmth. But I've made my peace with the uncertainty because this was never about him. It was always about me taking back my narrative and deciding how I wanted to live. And I choose to live with an open heart and an open mind, no matter how many times the world tries to slam its door in my face. So that's it. That's how my stepfather, who once disowned me for being gay, ended up turning to me, of all people, to save his life. And in a weird, twisted way, he ended up saving me too, or at least helping me save myself. Because in that moment, I saw clearly that I was no longer a victim. I was the author of my own story, free to write it however I saw fit. And I wrote in a twist he never saw coming. The queer kid he threw away was the one who showed him what compassion truly means. Even if he can't fully grasp or return that compassion, I know I'm better off for having chosen it. And for me, that's enough.